So without further ado, my dear friend, and funkadelic artist, Dean Haspiel. In the 80s, I was at SUNY Purchase Film School, where my friend Dean was living across from me, and I had just read Watchmen, and comics were starting to change a lot.
Now, what year are you talking about? Because this is obviously way before that.
This is right after Watchmen came out, 87?
I think 86 was Watchmen, and I believe I had gone to high school of music and art, and then in my senior year, music and art got married to performing arts and became LaGuardia High School. And I was in the first graduating class in 1985 of LaGuardia High School. And then during that year of 1985,
Well, why don't we start with during that year and what you were doing and who you were working with.
Right. So what happened was I had befriended a guy named Larry O'Neill, whose father is a man named Denny O'Neill. And Denny O'Neill's famous for having written Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics, and Batman, and then later on Iron Man. And he wrote tons of great comic books and was also an editor at both Marvel and DC Comics. He had a son named Larry. Larry went to high school with me. We became friends. He would get hip to when an artist would need an assistant. And back then in 1985, he got a gig with a guy named Howard Chaykin. Howard Chaykin was like a hot dog of the field back then, and even today his name resonates. And he still works in comics. But back then he was doing a comic called American Flag, and he needed an assistant. And then he was sharing a studio with a guy named Walter Simonson, who was famous for his Thor run, and he recently came out with another book, was on I think the New York Times bestseller list last week, if I'm correct, called The Judas Coin. And other artists like Frank Miller, who would go on to do Sin City and the Spirit movie and Daredevil and Batman, Dark Knight and all that stuff as well, had once been in the studio. Down the hall, another guy named Bill Sienkiewicz had moved in, and he was famous for doing a run on New Mutants, which is an X-Men title. Also worked on Elektra Assassin with Frank Miller. Again, more Daredevil comics and stuff like that. He needed an assistant, so I became an assistant to Bill, and then would hang out with Howard and Walter and Larry down the hall until eventually I became a second assistant to Howard Chaykin, and also would help out Walter Simonson.
That's Dean's first picture, by the way, when he was 2 or 3.
I put a whole thing together
Right.
in chronological order, basically, for this talk, and I guess I forgot to put that drawing.
Yeah, I made him put it in there. But yeah, that's Dean's first. You could tell that there was going to be a lot of talent.
That's what my parents said. They said based on that drawing, they knew I was going to be a talented artist, to be able to. I must have been like 22 when I drew that, I think. No, I was a toddler of sorts, I guess, and I think that's the back of a paper bag, or that used to house whiskey, maybe. I don't know why I drew a clown, except I know that later on in life, there are two things that terrify me. That's clowns and mannequins, of course. My parents saw that, and they went to my art teacher, whose name was Mrs. Friend, and said to Mrs. Friend, look, he's talented. He obviously draws a little bit better than the other kids. It wasn't a competition, it was just a fact. Said to the art teacher, should he start taking lessons? And she said, no. And we're like, why? They said, because at this early stage of his development, he's just going to start copying what the teacher shows him and how to draw, and he won't develop into his own style. So after school, in 1985, 17 years old, I would have this heady kind of experience. Like, I was rejecting everything in high school. I rejected fine art, also because all the fine art teachers were rejecting comics. I would be sitting there doodling in my books or doing little narratives, and they would kind of slap my hand and say, that's not real art. And I always rejected that idea, so I rejected their art. It was kind of like this mini battle happening for so long, until recently, of course, comics are considered cool, which is, thank you. But going back to 1985, which if I'm 17, that means about 5 years earlier, I had made a conscious decision at age 12 that I was going to grow up to one day draw the Fantastic Four. That was my dream. I was going to pencil the Fantastic Four on a monthly basis. And then, of course, I discovered Harvey Pekar, who, if any of you have seen the American Splendor movie or are familiar with Harvey Pekar, he did the polar opposite of, like, you know, genre franchise comics. He wrote stories about his own life, so much so that there's a lot of, he excavated the mundanity of his life, the boring aspects. And he's famous for, covering at least 30 years worth of this stuff as it was happening. In a weird way, his comic was like the first blog, if you think about it,
When did you decide you were going to be in this business? And as you said, you wanted to be a pencil for the Fantastic Four and do that kind of stuff. When did you think maybe...
There's desire, right, there's desire, and then there's a commitment. There's two completely different things. I know many people today who are like, because comics are hip and cool, that decide they're going to make a comic, and then they try to make a comic, and they see there's a struggle, and there's a lot of work involved in making comics, because it is words and pictures. And then what happens often is that after their first effort, they kind of just walk away and try something else that's more fun. It is a certain kind of commitment. So there's a desire. I mean, I think it's cool to write and draw comics, but then there's actual doing the work, and then learning how to make your comics better throughout the years. You really have to make a committed decision to decide, I need to do this because it's of my passion. It's a passionate thing. Nowadays, it's easier to at least get published because we have the internet. We don't need a publisher to dictate, if you can get your stuff out there.
Which could be a double-edged...
It can be. I mean, there's marketing. Publishers have certain tools and things in place that can help you. And yet, if you're waiting online and waiting to be noticed, don't wait. You now have these DIY tools, as I like to say. So I was always just drawing comics, and I befriended a guy named Martin Powell who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And we used to, what they called it, writing letters, I think, back then. And we'd write letters to each other and send me a script, and I'd start drawing pages and send stuff out. And eventually, once in a while, if I could afford it, I'd make a phone call, because it was long distance. I felt like a gift was coming in the mail when I would get like a letter from him with a response or a script. And then I'd be drawing this story, and eventually, guess what? We secured a publisher. And we got this published in comic book form. I remember going to St. Mark's Comics in, I think it was 1987, and the first issue of The Verdict is on the stands. I look at the work now and I cringe at it, but then I was so proud, In fact, if you're not cringing at what you did last year as an artist, you're not growing. That's how I always feel. DC Comics, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, it says bonus book. Started this bonus book program where they would get young independent artists doing, they would give them a script, and it would just be all new talent that they would give this 16-page insert in the middle of a regular book, like in this case was Detective Comics, which is a Batman comic. Yeah, that was my first kind of DC Comics publication. I thought I had it set. I was going to draw comics for the rest of my life and work for DC and maybe Marvel, and that's not what happened. So what Opposable Thumbs is a collection of stories. Now, the stories I did in Keyhole ran the gamut of being crime, superhero, and some kind of semi-autobiographical stories, i.e. memoir. Memoir became more and more prominent and interesting, I guess, in the comics world. A lot of people were navel-gazing and doing all that kind of stuff in their works, or crying about their girlfriend leaving them. So I just told kind of crazy stories because a lot of things would happen to me when I'd walk out my door. At one point, I felt like I was a magnet for trouble because things constantly were happening. I don't know why. This is a character that has evolved, Billy Dogma, and his girlfriend, Jane Legit. I was able to secure, actually the same publisher, to put out a collection of Billy Dogma stories called Aim to Dazzle. And Billy Dogma started as a newspaper strip in 1995 in the East Village of a paper called The Hangover. And I would just do these little one-offs and little things, and eventually the little kind of strips would then turn into like a 3-page story or a 5-page story or a 1-page story. I wasn't doing anything too substantial or epic. I was just telling like these little tales. Once again, you put out stuff, editors are going to notice you again. I had been evolving my style somewhat, and I started using more of a thicker brush style which I think you can see a little bit here and even in the Opposable Thumbs cover. The now editor-in-chief of Marvel, Axel Alonso, who then was Spider-Man editor, putting together an anthology called Spider-Man's Tangled Web. And it seemed that he was using more independent artists to draw and write stories. I had the fortune to basically draw the origin of J. Jonah Jameson, who we all know is Peter Parker's boss at the Daily Bugle. You know, and I always like a script that's more, encourages the artist to kind of bring their storytelling sensibilities. That's why you hire the artist. The artist should have as much say that the artist is the co-author in comics. I love superheroes and I love genre, but again, I'm kind of mostly known for having drawn other people's true life stories. The reason why this book came about with Harvey Pekar is called The Quitter was because I had drawn about 4 or 5 1- or 3-page stories that Harvey had written for American Splendor, his comic series. And then at one point, I was also an assistant to a movie producer named Ted Hope. While kind of like helping him out at his apartment, I discovered tons of comic books. He was a big comic book fan. He liked Harvey Pekar's American Splendor. He had a script for American Splendor written by someone else, a different iteration of it. And I said to him, you know, I'm working with Harvey Pekar on a couple comics. You know, it'd be a really cool idea is if you made a movie with Harvey. He said, I'd love to make a movie with Harvey. I'd love to do an American Splendor. So I set up a phone call conversation, and 1.5 years later, the movie version of American Splendor won the Sundance Award, you know, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
And he wrote a comic thanking you for getting the film made.
Yeah.
How Dean Haspiel got my film made.
And as part of the thank you, he said, you know, he asked me, within reason, how could he thank me back? And I said, well, I'd like to do something more substantial with you. And then I still want to do a graphic novel with him. And we arrived at this story called The Quitter, and I was actually able to bring it to DC Comics, and I was able to sell that to them, and we got a Harvey Pekar comic published by DC Comics. At the time, we called it something else, and then one day he called up very upset, and he called me and the editor, and he got us both on the phone, and he said, I'm gonna call the comic The Quitter. I want everyone in the world to know that I was a quitter. I was like, okay, Harvey, like, I'm sorry, like, that you need to tell people that. And if you read the story, you'll find out why. He was kind of a bully. If he couldn't be the best at something, he would quit it.
Speaking about, real quick, stick figures, you know, as you know, everything today in film is comics now, you know, comics. And
Avengers.
I was reading a Scorsese book recently, Scorsese with him, and he's being interviewed, and he has always drawn storyboards since he was a kid.
He himself.
He himself on every film. It helps him with the lighting, he says.
Sure. He
uses one pencil, which they stopped making, and he bought them all out on eBay. And he said it helps him. Kazan, the famous Neely Kazan, despised storyboarding. Said it ruined the making of films, and it was too preconceived, etc., etc. I believe in storyboarding. I think it helps you have, and you tape it up, and you have a whole framework. But some people really dislike it as a director. Your thoughts as in film?
I think it's crucial to do a storyboard so you know if you're on set, and we all know that when you have a set, that's a lot of money happening around you at all times. When I'm sitting at an art table by myself with a white blank piece of paper, the budget is anything. I can make an explosion happen, you know, or I could draw a man just talking to another person. You know, the budget wavers at all times based on what I draw on that blank piece of paper, and it's all the same. It's just your time and your talent. What I think is good about doing storyboards for film is that now that you've set it, you can now not have to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's your default. That's your your plan B, and then you can allow whatever's going to happen on set to happen now. As long as, again, you stick to what is this that we're doing? Why are we here?
The plan.
The plan. But then when you're working with other people, you know, collaborate, see what happens.
And things change.
And if that sucks, then let's go to the storyboards. We got the storyboards. I had been wanting to do kids comics for a while, and I just never found an opportunity or a door or an opening. And then one day I get a letter from Françoise Mouly, If you know who she is, she's one of the art directors of The New Yorker. I think she art directs the covers. And she's also married to Art Spiegelman. They had also edited a series and curated a series called Raw that came out in the 80s. She was like famous in my head. And then I get a letter from her saying that I'm one of the greatest cartoonists of my generation and that she wants to work with me. I'm like, I didn't even know she knew who I was. And then my girlfriend at the time said something really mean. She's like, yo, she probably wrote that to about 100 different cartoonists. So thanks. Thanks, I love you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming down.